let's begin. Yeah, it's true. I think that when people talk about, the way that I'd like to talk about it, just very quickly, I think that it's perfectly clear if you say that God equals is equivalent to substance, and substance is equal to all of nature, right? But if you want to distinguish substance from nature, you would say that substance is the ground for everything that has any place in the natural realm. And so that's really all there is to it. It's a bit confusing to see that the word God used all the time. If Spinoza had used the word nature instead, it would make absolutely no difference whatsoever. It would make no difference whatsoever in his argument. So that's the best way to understand it. I just look at God and think nature.
Yeah, and I tried to understand or explain why he used the word God, and what I came up with is that there's a number of qualities people normally associate with that word, and the God that Spinoza is talking about shares most of those qualities. Like being the most powerful thing, being omnipresent, always existing, a lot of those kind of things. So that's one of the reasons that he used that, I think, because it was hard to come up with another word. Okay, so let's get to E1P22. So that means ethics, part 1, proposition 22.
Okay.
And how it,
if I may suggest something, Blake, sorry to interrupt. Could you make the text a little bit bigger on the screen? Because
yeah, probably. How's that?
Okay.
Bigger? That's good.
That's good. That's good.
Okay. Okay, so the way that reads is whatever follows from some attribute of God insofar as it is modified by a modification which, through the same attribute, exists necessarily and is infinite. So what he's talking about here is so far it is modified in some attribute of God insofar as modified by God through this attribute exists necessarily and is infinite. So he's talking about the infinite modes. He's talking about the attributes in any of the attributes, what the infinite modes are. So, and just to recap, attributes are just kind of the way that the most broadest way that you think of things. And he says at one point that there's only 2 ways that man can comprehend the attributes, and one is thought and the other one's extension. So if you think of anything and then you say, well, what is that? And what is that? And what is that? And you keep getting to more general terms, you end up with one of those 2 things, either something that's thought, or he calls extension, which is something that takes up space, really, something physical. So whatever follows from the attribute of God insofar as it is modified by a modification through the same attribute exists necessarily and is infinite. So he's talking about these infinite modes or aspects of an attribute. And one example is like the laws of nature. So gravity and all these things are infinite modes. And all the laws of nature are necessarily and infinite. So all of these laws that are infinite inside the attributes are infinite as well. So that's really all he's saying. It's pretty basic. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's go.
I don't want to hold things up so quickly, but it is interesting that we're talking about 2 infinite modifications following from one attribute, right? That's a kind of a complicated thing to get into at this point, so maybe we should just let that go for now.
Okay. So then E1P23, which is kind of a sibling proposition, says every mode which exists necessarily and is infinite, so he's talking about infinite modes, has necessarily had to follow from either the absolute nature of some attribute of God or from some attribute modified by a modification which exists necessarily and is infinite. So again, the infinite modes are these laws of nature. And he's saying that all are an expression of God, either through one attribute or another, so that they're all part of God or expressions of God, and they all are infinite. So they're true throughout all of the universe. So like the laws of gravity, let's say. So he's saying that each one of these infinite attributes is consistent throughout the entirety of the universe. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Then E1P24. The essence of things produced by God does not involve existence. So we can imagine things that exist not existing. For example, Blake. Imagine I was never born. So essence doesn't involve my existence. When you think of any individual thing, you could imagine it not existing. So existence is not part of what makes it up. That's just something that it so happens Blake does exist, right? But mermaids don't exist, or particular mermaids don't exist. And so existence is not, for either one, existence is not in the essence. It's not one of the things. Like if you think of Blake, one of the essences of Blake is that he's a human being, right? It's my essence of being a human being. But existing, because you couldn't imagine Blake if he wasn't a human, he'd be something else, a dog or a cat or a fish or whatever, right? So, and here I have God is the only thing whose essence involves existence. So if you think about God, let's say the universe, you know that it exists, because if you have the thought, that proves that something exists, and that something makes up the everything, right? So here he says, the essence of things produced by God does not involve existence. So all of the things that are expressions of God don't involve existence. Does that make sense?
Like, yes, it does. Like, by the way, your screen is not showing now.
Oh, yeah, something popped up. Let me share screen and go back to that guy. Say share.
Yeah, there you go again.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Something on my screen changed. I don't know what caused that. Okay.
I think it was me. I think it was me.
Oh, okay. The essence of things produced by God does not involve existence. So that's number 3 there. So does anyone have any questions about that? That one's much more.
The essence, I take it, what's one of the things that's important here seems to be that the essence is considered eternal, infinite rather than finite. The
That's
essence
right.
or nature is sort of like Aristotle's nature without the teleology in a way. So the essence, we exist, and the modes exist, but they exist in a finite way. It's not of our essence that they exist, whereas as God's existence, for God, the existence is part of his infinite eternal essence.
That's right.
Is that close?
Yeah. Now
If I
Aristotle.
could just interrupt there. Oddly enough, Spinoza doesn't actually define the term essence until the beginning of book 2. So he hasn't actually followed the geometrical method. Basically, I don't remember it word for word, but the gist of it is that the essence is the definition of the thing, whatever properties define the thing. You can define, when you define a thing, that you cannot generally deduce the existence of the thing from the definition. That's what I take to be the meaning of Proposition 24.
Right. Aristotle had a good way of explaining it. There was two things. One is called accidental, and one was accidental, and the other one was so in other words, Blake McBride, he has certain aspects. He's like a human being. These things are are definite, but the shirt, the color, I could be wearing a yellow shirt, I could be wearing a white shirt, I could be wearing, different shirts. So those are not essential qualities of Blake. The fact that Blake is a human being, that's essential. That's, I wouldn't be the same if I was a book or if I was a dog or something like that. So the essence of Blake, one of the essences of Blake is that I'm a human being. So he's saying the essence of a thing produced by God does not involve existence. So all the things that you think about Blake, you can't think that that existence is one of those things that are my essence. You could say it's an accident. So like I said, me wearing a blue shirt or a red shirt or something like that, those are just accidental kind of things. They don't really change the fact that I'm Blake. Well, likewise with existence, I could exist and I might not have existed. I might have, never been born or whatever. So existence is not part of my essence. Does that make sense?
I have a question. I wonder if anyone knows the existentials, the existentialist slogan that existence precedes essence. I wonder if that's a response to this medieval idea that essence precedes existence. I wonder if anyone knows.
Oh, I'm certain that's exactly what it's referring to. Yeah. And it goes all the way. That's a classical distinction. I mean, Aristotle himself makes the distinction between essence and existence,
Yeah, but for the medievals, essence precedes existence, and then Sartre.
Yes.
Formula.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
Perhaps what he's doing is in response to this medieval view.
The existentialists, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's certainly what they're doing. Yeah. They were being clever by switching them around the order, right? But certainly.
Well, no, the claim was that you find yourself existing, and then it's up to you to make what you will of this situation.
You make your own essence. Yeah.
Essence.
Yeah.
Whatever. It's off topic. Let's move on.
Yeah. But that's interesting that you should mention that essence is not defined until the second book, like early in the second book, within the first 5 propositions, I believe. But he does at the same time prove that existence is essential to God. It's part of his definition. And he doesn't just assume that, he proves it in those propositions leading up to 15. And 15 is the culmination of that proof. So it's a very interesting thing. You think about the geometrical method. I think that he must be talking about essence in terms of limited beings as well as the infinite being. And I think that's probably why he wants to introduce a definition for essence there, because he has made the assumption that a person's going to have at least a working knowledge of this, how to understand essence and how to understand existence as being an essential attribute. Otherwise, he couldn't have provided that proof. Right?
Well, here he is talking about the finite modes, the essence of things produced by gods. So, in fact, he is at fault here. He should have defined essence much earlier because he's using this word throughout book 1.
Yeah.
Well, I have a related question. Does Spinoza ever define existence? Because I've been curious what he means by that. If essence is the definition, what do we understand by existence?
I think he's just thinking of objects in the physical world, and he's taking it for granted that the ordinary language meaning of existence applies.
But ideas have existence as well.
Yeah, well, that's the distinction, I believe. So, I mean, as I understand it, the essence really exists in the attribute of thought, and existence in the attribute of extension. My understanding.
Yes. So if I have a thought about a certain picture, that thought actually exists. If I'm not thinking about it, that thought doesn't. For me.
Yeah, and the other thing too is that he at one point he refers to the use of the word being as bad Latin. It's kind of amusing, but being, you understand what is meant by being, right, Alex? I mean, there's things that potentially exist and things that actually exist. And if they actually exist, they have being in the world, right? And so I think that he doesn't really he does actually talk about existence, the term existence, early in the book, and he compares it to the use of the word being. And so I think that they're equivalent terms. You know, being, of course, can can have many different properties. You know, there's ways of being that, you know, I would even say that it wouldn't surprise me if we discover at some point that that Spinoza would say that possibility as opposed to impossibility, in the case of possibility, that has greater being than impossibility. I know he does not say that, but just by way of example, that's the sort of sense of existence. It's very broad in Spinoza.
Spinoza does say that all.
Sorry to interrupt, but Nick and Fred have been waiting to join in. I wonder if we need to maintain a queue here because the group is sufficiently small that we can be quite informal about it.
Yeah, so if Nick or if Fred, Nick, go ahead first, and then whenever you're finished, then Fred can go. And generally speaking, you don't have to put up your hand; just interrupt.
All right, thanks. Yeah, maybe I just want to share a thought on this difference between essence and existence, without going through a all-out discussion on the French existentialism or that, but just focus on the context where Spinoza was writing about this. Obviously, the influence of the medieval scholastics is very heavy at the time of Spinoza. And one of the key focus of the medieval scholastics was on God. So they were thinking about God. And for them, it was a consensus that the God's existence is part of the God's essence. So but the very definition of God, therefore the very essence of God, imply necessarily the existence. So that was their view. So that was the view on God. Now here, Spinoza, of course, talking about the modes, which is our things, the human like Blake, the individual Blake. So that is the opposite to the thinking of God, and therefore it has a different formulation, different conclusion, that when we come to talk about modes, such as the individual thing, then the essence of the definition of that thing does not imply existence. I think that's the point he was trying to make. Yeah,
that's right.
Could I just add one thing, that just something to keep in mind for later, that Spinoza distinguishes between the formal essence and the actual essence. And the actual essence of a thing, it's the conatus or desire, and the formal essence seems to be the definition. So I'm just flagging that as something that eventually we will have to sort out and see if we can arrive at an understanding of what he's driving at.
It's, all this stuff, is discussion is quite interesting, but it's, if you think of the parallel attributes, right? If an idea is referred to as an objective existence, if there is an idea in your mind, it is an objective representation of something that has formal reality, independent being in the world, right? So it's a strange kind of situation where there's no ideas in your mind that do not have reality in the world, as long as you're using your intellect, because we are subject to illusions, of course. So formal reality is an object that has being in the world. Objective reality is the idea you have of that object. And there is, of necessity, a representation of any object in the world within under the attribute of thinking. Otherwise, well, that's just simply the case. Okay, you just have to take it for granted. There's always one. At least under the infinite attribute of thought, there's always an idea representing anything that has formal reality in the world.
Right, but you got to be careful with that, because there's thought with respect to a man and thought with respect to God. And so, and there's representations in both. But let me give you an example of, if I'm thinking about a mermaid, it doesn't mean a mermaid exists somewhere. What
Right.
it means, electrical patterns in my head are representing that mermaid. So it's saying the physical representation in my head and the thought of the mermaid are exactly parallel.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I was thinking, strictly speaking, of under the infinite attribute. In other words, God's intellect.
Okay.
As opposed to any limited intellect. So Fred, you're up.
Okay.
Somewhere,
I think Fred wanted to say something.
Okay.
somewhere, I don't recall exactly where, Spinoza does give an example of the distinction between essence and existence. And his example was a sculptor. For Spinoza says that as I recall, says that the concept or the idea in the sculptor's mind and all of a statue, of a non-existent statue, and all the steps it would take to produce it constitutes the essence. And the sculptor works on that and refines it until an actual sculpture exists, and that's the existence. I don't really like that example because it almost flirts with Platonic idealism, which I don't think is the intent at all. But that's the one example he gives. But I do take it from that this is intended by Spinoza to be really kind of a commonplace, obvious, quotidian distinction, and not a abstract scholastic exercise, the distinction between essence and existence. We all, I take it, should know pretty much what the difference between essence and existence is, according to Spinoza.
I think it's true. As Patrick has pointed out, he offers a very clear and precise definition of essence subsequent to his use of the term throughout the first book, right? And I think that's because he just assumes everyone has a general understanding of what essence means. And just in general, essence just means one thing, and that is, how do you define the thing? The classical philosophers would say, how do you define this thing? Well, it has certain essential attributes, and those attributes make that thing a way of being, right? And then you could ask whether or not it exists. If they find a contradiction between any of the so-called attributes that are enumerated of this so-called thing, if they contradict one another, then you say, well, it doesn't exist, period. That's all there is to it. It can't exist, it's impossible. So, I mean, that's just a working understanding of the term. And actually, for our purposes right now, when we talk about existence, let's just take it in the simple sense. Let's take it in the ordinary sense. That's all we really need, It is actually in the world. In one way or another, it's in the world, whether as a thought or as a manifest or as an example of something extended in space. I think we're safe just relying on that basic understanding that we have.
Okay, shall I continue?
Yes.
Okay, E1P25. Let me outline it here. Whoops. Not what I intended. Okay. God is the efficient cause not only of their existence of things, but also of their essence. So think about this. If God is like the whole universe, is there anything that is not anything that exists that's not just a product of the universe or an element or a part of the universe? And here I have notes. I have all modes are created by God through God's expression of existence. So all the modes exist just out of the expression of the universe. You could think about the universe exploding, and all these things are its things, the planets, the animals, the pigs, everything gets created, and it's just all part of this one big universe. So it's all product of this universe. There's no quality of any mode that is not a product of God. Therefore, God is necessarily the cause of the mode's essence. So that everything about me is a product of prior causes of the universe. And so there's nothing about me that's not a product of those things. That's all he's saying right there.
I always, when I pick up, every time I pick up Spinoza again, I always scratch my head when I come to his various species of cause, trying to figure out his notions of cause. And eventually I sort of get it, but then time passes and I lose it again because it's a little befuddling. So, for example, in Proposition 18, we saw that God is the immanent, not the transitive cause of all things. So we, at the very least, have as cause the notions of immanent and transitive and efficient. And we can perhaps add our sort of commonplace notion of a mechanical deterministic physical cause.
Fred, could I try and answer your question? I find that Wilson is very good on this. He really answers in great detail this type of question. The main point about 17th century science is the transition from Aristotelian physics to mechanistic, well, pre-Newtonian physics. So Aristotle had 4 types of causes: efficient, material, formal, and final. And as far as Spinoza is concerned, the rest of 17th century science, it's really only the efficient cause that's needed to describe things. Efficient causality is just causality as we commonly understand it today. And Spinoza absolutely rejects final causality, teleology. We'll see that in the appendix to book 1. I don't think he uses the term formal cause at all. The formal cause is what causes an acorn to become a tree.
Yeah, I think he does use formal cause a lot,
I
actually.
don't believe he does. I know that, Robert, that you have, so we'll look into that sometime.
Yeah, I think when you say God has an essence and things necessarily follow from that essence, you're talking about a formal cause.
Well,
so
I don't believe that Spinoza uses that term. We'll look into it.
All right.
But to continue with Fred's question, according to Wilson again, to say that something is an immanent cause, and he says, of course, that God is an immanent cause of everything, means that the effect cannot actually be distinguished from the cause. The effect is already manifest in the cause. And that's the opposite of the transient or transitive cause, where you have action at a distance, a God outside of the universe acting transitively on nature. Spinoza also uses the term first cause, but that's in the traditional Aristotelian sense. So all of those types of causality, they're very well explained in Wilson's book.
Also, when he uses the word, sorry, Fred, when he uses the word cause, he also, it's a very extensive term. It could often mean something like an explanation, just an explanation, what caused this? You provide an explanation, not anything like efficient cause, but just an explanation, a rational explanation for something. Sorry, I interrupted you, Fred.
No, that was good. Thanks, Patrick. It almost sounds like the distinction between the immanent and the transitive cause is roughly analogous to Kant's distinction between analytic and synthetic, but that probably takes us afield.
Yeah. The way I see it is that I am the eminent cause of my lungs. Nobody's really the transitive cause. No one came in and took an artificial lung and put it in me. You know, that's for something that comes in from outside, does it to you, and then is continues on its way. So that's the transitive. The eminent is it's just a product. It's just a product of the thing that itself. Just like we're just products of God. You know,
Yeah, and God is constantly causing things, and the effect is felt in God himself, you know, because there's nothing beyond God anyway, right? So it's I think when you talk, okay, I'm just going to shut up now. Sorry.
So any other questions about P25? Okay, I'll go to P26. Okay. A thing which has been determined to produce an effect has necessarily been determined in this way by God, and one which has not been determined by God cannot determine itself to produce an effect. Okay, so we know that all modes, being an expression of God, has not only their essence fully determined by God, but also all of their effects. So not only is the makeup of Blake just a product of God, but all of my actions and thoughts and movements and everything, which are really just products of prior causes as well. And so he's basically saying there's no escaping God. There's no escaping and saying, I'm going to get outside of it, or I'm going to not be a part of it or something. You're infinitely determined by the expression of God, really. Does that make sense? James?
Yes. So he's talking about, let's say, Blake, you're a finite being, right? And so you would be an effect of an infinite cause. So is that immanent or is that transitive?
Well, that's not what he's saying there. A thing which has been determined to produce an effect. So Blake produces effects, right? Like
Yeah.
I lift my glasses or something. And one which has not been determined by God cannot determine itself to produce an effect. So,
But there is nothing that has not been determined by God. He already said that, right?
right, that's right. And he's just saying it's not
So
only,
that's why this is confusing to me.
well, it's not
He's
only that
bringing in something that he already said couldn't happen.
That's right. He is. But that's all he is doing, and that is all he is doing. He's just
Isn't he just saying there are no free agents?
yeah.
Something that has not been determined by God cannot determine itself.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah. He seems a little bit repetitive, but he's not really. It's just sometimes you can anticipate a proposition subsequent to any given proposition. You know, it's quite clear that he could not propose anything other than what he is doing in 26, given the fact that everything in naturata is determined by the essence of God originally. So
Right. So what he's doing is trying to seal up all the holes that people aren't saying, but, you know, some special case. And he's trying to say there are no special cases. All the things and all their actions and this and that. He's enumerating and going through. He's trying to seal it up so that said you can't say, but he didn't say this, you know, something like that. So he's saying it explicitly. But you're right, Robert, that it's kind of a natural consequence of what he said before. An obvious.
So I'm still stuck on this idea of we are a finite being, which is
Yeah.
an effect of an infinite God. You know, if we're the effect of an infinite cause.
well,
And
that's
so
a
does that
very
mean that-
that's a very complicated problem.
Because it isn't, I don't like the idea that we're caused by God. We're an expression of God. I like that word a lot better. Because and then really what's caused Blake is my parents and you know my upbringing and all these prior causes caused me. So each mode is an effect of all prior causes.
Mhm.
And of course, the whole thing is just an expression of God.
Yeah, but
Right.
you know, James has hit upon a very important point, though, and that is the problem of how the infinite attributes, from the infinite attributes follow infinite modes, and then there's infinite intermediary modes, and then somehow at some point in time finite modes appear, and that is something that's quite difficult to understand. I think we're far from the point in the text where actually even tonight maybe we can look at those propositions, James, but they're really mysterious, very mysterious.
Well, keep in mind that modes are not substances. So modes are just a convenience. There's not really there's no separate Blake and separate chair and separate, these are just convenience. It's like the wave example that I gave. So we see a wave and we say that's wave X and we watch wave X, but it's not really just a solid thing. It's, it's a convenient for me to say, look at wave X because it's big or whatever. It's a way to communicate, but the way we differentiate one mode from another is through what? Motion and rest, right? So don't confuse and think all of a sudden that these modes are individual substances, because they're not.
Are all modes finite?
No, there's infinite modes and
So
infinite.
there are infinite modes.
Yeah, like gravity. It's the same.
Could I just give the examples that the only two examples of infinite modes that Spinoza gives in the Ethics are motion and rest in the attribute of extension, and the infinite intellect in the attribute of God, the attribute of thought. And both of those are immediate infinite modes. They follow immediately from God. There are apparently also other infinite modes covered by Proposition 23 that Spinoza doesn't actually specify, that follow from those two.
One of the intermediate,
sorry?
one example he offers for the intermediate, the infinite intermediate modes is the face of the universe. He uses the expression
That's
face
right.
of the.
That's right, but it's in one of the letters. It's not in the Ethics.
Yeah, it's not in the Ethics.
He produced that example when he was pressed by one of his correspondents for an example of an infinite mode that was not immediately produced by God. So, but it's not even mentioned in the Ethics. So
actually, I think that I'll take it upon myself.
I think the important point here is the one we're skirting around. There is a gap in this theory of modes. He doesn't explain how to get from infinite modes to finite modes. We're seeing the next proposition is about the finite modes, but he doesn't explain how finite modes arise out of infinite modes.
Yes, but I do believe that you can explain it on the basis of what he has given us.
Well, we'll see in the next proposition, or proposition 28, is it, Blake? The one that talks about the infinite chain of cause and effect?
I don't think I get to that. I think that's
did you?
Yeah, which I can. I mean, I could definitely do it.
Well, I think we should, because this really is the sort of link between the series of propositions about the modes and Proposition 29, which is where he states necessitarianism.
Yeah, let's do 28. Like it's easy enough.
Well,
it's a funny thing to say, but
we're on 26, right? So why don't we go to 27 first?
I'm sorry, of course.
Okay, so ready?
Yeah.
Oh, I was going to ask Robert a question, because you made a comment, I think, unless I misunderstood it, that finite modes are a product of infinite modes. Where is that?
I know what you're contending against already, Blake, because you're going to say that the finite modes are part of the infinite sequences of cause and effects that have duration running throughout all of eternity. I realize that, but you still have to reconcile the fact that the essence originates in the infinite modes and they follow from the infinity of God in general, the essence of things of duration, but the duration itself is determined by the infinite sequence of causes and effects through all eternities. You still have to reconcile these two points in explaining the nature of a finite mode. It doesn't, the infinite sequence of causes and effects doesn't account for the nature of the finite mode alone. It still ultimately depends upon they still have to be understood as properties following from the essence of God in the infinite properties of God. So I'll just say that much.
Can I just interject on that point, Robert, please?
Sure.
So there is no intervention whatsoever in sensible apprehension, perception of the world by God, no intervention. So in conceiving an object, in Spinoza's terms, sense of that term, is it's only possible once you're in the universe, right? So you're in the universe. So what if you're not in the universe? Where is the creative act? Where does the universe?
God is the world, and God.
Yeah, I got that, but
okay. And then so whenever God causes anything, he causes it in the world, and the effect is felt in the world. Like it's cause and effect is really a false distinction between cause and effect in immanent cause. Immanent cause means that God, let's just say, something comes.
Who caused God and the world?
I'm sorry?
What?
Go ahead.
That's once you're in the world. You have God not affecting the world, got it. But you're already in the world when you're having what Spinoza's situation of, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right, I'm just perceiving this. Everything he's explaining is already in the world, and yes, God is a part of it. But where did that come from, is my question.
It's self-caused, according to Spinoza. God is the world. There's nothing outside the world.
Yeah, how are you not in the world?
Sorry?
There's nothing outside the world. There's nothing outside the world.
Well, I mean, it's a reasonable, rational question.
Yeah, but Spinoza's answer is that the world, that nature, is self-caused because there's nothing outside of nature that could serve as its cause.
Well, how does he
nature, or think of the universe as all that is? If that's the definition of the universe, there's nothing outside of the universe that could bring it into existence.
If we're going to use a causal model, every cause has a previous cause. So
that's what he's going to say about in Proposition 28, that he's going to say that explicitly about finite modes.
In the world.
Yeah, but the world is the substance, which is, according to Spinoza, the cause of itself.
Okay, I'll just think about it, but I wanted to raise that question and to pose that as a way of looking at this model is being encapsulated, and and assuming that there is no cause of God in the world, there is no cause, that the world just exists. That's it. God just exists. And
Well, listen, Ella,
Well,
God
well,
has.
the classical theological view was that God was always the cause of himself, and in addition to that, was also the cause of nature. And Spinoza says, well, we can just collapse those two together, and God, which is nature, is the cause of itself.
Right, exactly. Well said.
So very quickly, part of God's essence is existence. That effectively means he has existed for eternity, like for all time. There's never a point in time when God did not exist, right? And so when God causes something, because God entails all of the world, the effect is felt in the world. That means that God causes effects within himself. So, and that's all there is to it. There's no distinction really. Again, immanent cause really means that there is no distinction between cause and effect. You can't distinguish the two ultimately. Anything that happens in the world was caused by God. Where did it happen? In God.
I use the word expression a lot, and I thought of a way of explaining what I mean by that. When I was first conceived, there was one cell, and it had a bunch, and it had a the genetic makeup, and the rest of my body and evolution is a product, an expression of those genes that were in there to start with. So I'm an expression of my genes. So if you give me sufficient whatever to survive, that's what I would produce is Blake. Well, likewise, God, all the things in God, all the modes and all these things are just expressions of God. They're just the way God represents himself.
I get it that God is a unity of nature, everything, okay? But if you use the model, your example, Blake, genes are made of proteins, and proteins, eventually you're going to get down to some type of quark, wave, something, particle, wave. And you're always going to come to the question, where did that come from? And if your answer is, well, it's all one thing, I could see how it would be rational to accept that because that's all we can speculate about. Exactly. As long as we accept that, but yeah, we can go on and develop it in other ways. I'll think about it. Thank you.
I think there's one thing really important to understand though, Ella, and that is Spinoza's not asking anybody to accept anything. He proves it. These propositions are a demonstration of that they are necessarily true of any world. Now, that's the argument that Spinoza is making.
Yeah, I know he has proofs and so forth, and yeah, I just was.
I mean, it's quite easy for Spinoza to prove that there's only one substance, and when he proves there's only one substance, that means there's only one world. And if you want to equate the world with God, that's perfectly fine. Go ahead and do so. It doesn't make any difference because there's only one, and there's nothing outside of God. All these things are proved. It's easy to prove for the singular substance. But anyway, I'm just simply saying you don't have to simply take anything by faith. You just look at his proof and say, is that a valid proof? Well, I guess there's only one substance. And as far as I'm concerned, there's only one substance. It's impossible for me to conceive of anything other than a single substance in the world in which we have our being. That's it. There's only one. Somebody come along and draw a line, or create a border or something. That's another world. It's just absurd, right? It's only one world. So anyway, Nick.
Yeah, thanks. I was going to comment on the earlier question raised by James, but since Ella raised another very stimulating question, so I just want to share my thought on that, Ella. I think the way you reason appears to me very Aristotelian, commonsensical. You know, you got something happen, you observe something happen, you say, oh, there must be a cause, and that would need another cause, and et cetera, et cetera. So Aristotle would say, okay, that cannot go on forever. So it has to lead to a final or the first mover. So that's God. That's how he get there. And that's how he explain his ontology, his metaphysics.
Right.
But this is one thing that really struck me in the face when I first came to Spinoza. Spinoza asked a very simple question in the face of that line of reasoning. What makes you want to presume the chain of reasoning must go on for multiple steps? Why can't it be just the first step? That's his conclusion. You don't need to go on like Aristotle for multiple steps to reach God. You can just say at the step 0, that's it. That's the starting and the end of the chain of reasoning.
Right. Well, I think there's another interesting aspect of that, which is that if you follow Aristotle's logic, going back to the first mover, well, you can ask a question. Well, how did the first mover get there? And your answer is always going to be, well, he was always there. So then why do you need the first mover when you could just say, well, the universe was always here? It might have been a little something that a big bang made after that, but there was something there, energy or whatever. So he just says you don't need that extra step, because if you go to the step of transient God, which is the first mover, then you the logical question is, well, where did he come from? So you go forever. You can't. You're either going to say something created God, or you're going to say God was always there. One or the other.
Okay, well, getting away from the Aristotelian thought for the moment, Spinoza still has God enfolded in the one substance, along with nature and us and everything else.
Yeah,
When
but not along with, they're the same thing.
when we are all one substance, why is it that we think, we feel we have we think, we feel, we perceive, and God does not?
Because we're deluded.
We may be deluded, true enough, but why would God not have the same abilities or more?
Well, God, it's not clear from anything that Spinoza writes that God's intellect exists, is actually realized outside of finite modes. That the collection of it's not written down in Akashic records or anything. The definitive catalog of God's ideas doesn't seem to. There's no suggestion anywhere in Spinoza that there is something that exists outside of nature and experience.
Do we have free will?
No.
Yes, but I wanted to follow up real quickly.
No,
But
no, that's easy.
That was a no?
Yeah, that's no. That's an unambiguous no.
I have
We'll
a
see
follow-up,
lots
Patrick.
more about that in due course. In fact, starting next week.
Oh, wait, Patrick, aren't you going to do Necessitarianism tonight?
Well, I could, but the plan was to do it next week, wasn't it? I can do it, but it's a very big subject.
I anticipated you doing it tonight.
Well,
well, it's up to you. It's up to you.
Well, no, Robert, we had an exchange about this, and what I proposed was that we have an informal discussion about this issue because it's such a big issue.
Oh, okay. Let's have an informal discussion.
And that I would then do the remaining propositions next week. I'm ready to launch into that if that's the right direction to take. But we still have some more work to do here. I think we really need to look closely at proposition 28.
Yes.
Which is sort of the lead into proposition 29, where, where he states that there is nothing in nature that is contingent. This is his first statement of necessitarianism. But I would just like to point out to Nick, on the subject of infinite chains of cause and effect, if you look at the last phrase in proposition 28, Spinoza is explicitly allowing for infinite chains of cause and effect, contrary apparently to Aristotle. Well, I don't know Aristotle well enough to speak definitively about that, but it's very interesting that Spinoza accommodates infinite chains of cause and effects in the generation of the finite modes.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly correct to contrast Aristotle with Spinoza in that respect. An infinite chain of causes and effects is easy to comprehend in eternity. I mean, it's impossible to understand it in any other way than eternity. It has to be infinite. So, we better.
I think Nick may want to speak to that.
Yes, thank you, Patrick. It's very, very good comment. So this is the subtlety I am still trying to figure out. If you read as you said exactly, if you read the proposition 28, there's a key word in that very wordy sentence, finite.
That's right.
It was talking throughout finite stuff.
Modes,
whatever, finite. Now, when Aristotle started thinking about recourse to God as the first mover, that is recourse to an infinite cause. So I think the subtlety of there, and on that point, on the recourse to the infinite explanation or whatever, I think Spinoza says, okay, stop zero is as good as stop n or whatever. So that's how I reconcile this seemingly contradictory statement. In one case, he would say, "Oh, let's go on infinitely." In the understanding of the finite causes, but when we come to the infinite, then it's as good as starting at ground zero.
Well, of course, he also says in the, if I remember, Corollary 1 to proposition 16, I think, or 18, that God is the efficient cause of all things. Okay, so not only do we have this infinite chain of efficient causes for every finite mode, he's also saying that there is a direct causal link, that God is the efficient or immanent cause of everything.
Yeah, so that's why another keyword immanent come in.
Yeah. So Nick, you that's explained in Wolfson. What he means by immanent, to say it's a medieval idea again. To say that that something is an immanent cause means that it is manifest in its effect. You can't separate the cause from the effect. That's how Wolfson.
I mean, it's a very straightforward idea.
So it's very clear in the rest of the ethics that for Spinoza there is a direct causal link between God and the modes. Okay, that even though he's saying here in proposition 28 that there is an infinite chain of cause and effect behind every finite mode, it's clear that as finite intellects, there's no way we can accommodate that full causal chain of understanding. Yet he is saying that we can have an adequate understanding of finite modes, of particular things. That is to say, that we can understand them as following from the necessity of the divine nature. So there's this dual aspect to Spinoza's idea of causality, which we'll have to. It's hard to understand. We'll have to see how it plays out later in the subsequent books of the ethics.
Yeah. So I thought I was going to wait after break covered the 28th, but since we come to this point, so let me just share the point I was going to share when James asked a similar question. So James, the similar question was that, how do I understand the finite mode, the being myself, being created by infinite God, right? So that was the gist of the question. And here, we've been talking about this cause thing, and Wolfson's interpretation of Spinoza, Patrick, you said, very clearly, is that he's very detailed in answering that question. But the gist of the answer is that we have to be careful when we come to read Spinoza's terminology as they apply by the medieval scholastics or Aristotle, or they are all the same school of thought, which is what is meant by this cause. Yeah, we throw this word around, cause, as if we understand it. So cause, in one sense means one thing follows the other. Follows. And then Wolfenson's, after a lot of, back and forth texture discussion, he said, well, cause or following for Spinoza means to be contained in. To be contained in. So that's very different from the normal notion that if A cause B, that means A generate B, or B is born out of A. No. It's Wolfenson say, no, Spinoza never meant that. Spinoza only meant that B is contained in A. So there's a similar line of questioning, which was a famous problem of creation. So this medieval scholastic were troubled by the notion of creation. How could an immaterial God create material stuff? How does that happen?
Well,
so they had trouble with that.
Spinoza said that was a ludicrous notion that an immaterial God could create a material universe. He poses the same question and dismisses it.
So what was his answer then?
He says it's impossible. He said it's basically impossible for God to create extension unless he is extended himself.
Right. So God is the material.
Yeah. So therefore, we know that God is extended. Otherwise, we wouldn't have extension.
Exactly. So similar question. Then we come to that here. Instead of talking about material stuff or immaterial stuff to create the material stuff, we're talking about infinite entity create finite entity. So how could that be?
Again, Nick, we've already been over this. This is a big problem.
Can I try to answer Nick's question? As I understand it, what Proposition 28 is simply a statement of causal determinism, as we now understand it. Okay, determinism in physics says that the present or the future is causally determined by the past, and that there is a chain of cause and effect going back to the Big Bang, if indeed there is a Big Bang, or going back indefinitely, one thing being caused by another. Spinoza makes another claim starting in proposition 29, which is his claim of necessitarianism, that things could not possibly be other than they actually are. And that's frequently confused with causal determinism, but they're actually not the same thing. And this is a sort of big question that we can maybe begin to explore now, but what I had planned to cover was next week. I would recommend to anybody who's interested in really understanding this aspect of Spinoza's thought and its implications for his ethical doctrine, to look at the video that's referred to on the Meetup webpage. There's a contemporary philosopher, her name is Amy Kurofsky, who has written a book called A Case for Necessitarianism. This is the idea that things could not possibly be other than they are, or in Spinoza's term, that everything follows from the necessity of the divine nature. And Spinoza's claim is that we as finite intellects can come to see that all particular things follow from the necessity of the divine nature, even though we are not in a position to trace the full chain of cause and effect that results in the production of any given thing. So those are actually two separate ideas, causal determinism and necessitarianism. Spinoza embraces both, but I think it's very important in understanding Spinoza to realize that they're actually two different things. And here, so far in discussing the modes, he's only talked about causal determinism. This is the domain of natura naturata, infinite sequences of cause and effects. But he's also going to talk about necessitarianism, the idea that things could not possibly be other than they are, which is, at least to my way of thinking, the foundation of his ethical doctrine, although this only really comes into play towards the end of book 4 and in book 5. In that video that I mentioned by Amy Kurofsky, it's just an interview with her about her book. She makes some interesting arguments for necessitarianism, which do not depend either on causal determinism or on the principle of sufficient reason. And that's, I think, worth looking into, because when I present this material, I plan to do it next week, Spinoza does it entirely in theological terms, which means that we have to wade through these medieval ideas to arrive at something which is really a very simple consequence of the principle of sufficient reason in the strong form that Spinoza states it. Remember, the way Spinoza uses the principle of sufficient reason is to say that for any given state of affairs, there is a sufficient reason or an adequate explanation why this state of affairs obtains. So in the second proof for the existence of God, he says, for example, that if something doesn't exist, if something such as Spinoza's God, which he defined to be absolutely infinite with regard to the attributes, each of which was infinite in its own kind. In other words, maximal in every possible respect. Spinoza says, if this God does not exist, there must be something outside of God to prevent its existence, a sufficient reason for the non-existence of God. So this type of application of the principle of sufficient reason leads, I think, directly to Spinoza's necessitarianism. Okay, if you have a particular state of affairs, Spinoza says that there is always an answer to the question of why that state of affairs obtains. It is, in Spinoza's philosophy, logically necessary. It could not be otherwise. So this is Spinoza's Necessitarianism, and in Proposition 28, it's, I think, just a fairly conventional statement of causal determinism, which looks very similar, but it's not really the same thing, because causal determinism in physics, it says that the future course of the universe is determined by its state at any particular time, together with the laws of nature. But it doesn't give any explanation for the initial conditions or the laws of nature itself. It actually falls short of necessitarianism. Just as in Proposition 28, Spinoza has fallen short of giving an explanation for how infinite modes or finite modes are produced from infinite modes. Necessitarianism says that the initial conditions of the universe, or the conditions at any given time, are uniquely determined. The laws of nature are uniquely determined. There is only one possible history of the universe. That's, if you like, this is the Einstein block universe. Maybe I should stop here and get some reactions, and we'll see where the discussion goes.
Yeah, I think that, what you're saying is interesting. Something I hadn't really thought about. Because the way I see it is that determinism is just, it's not from natura naturata, it's just the cause and effect, the chain of cause and effect. But from natura naturans, you've got a solid thing that's doesn't move. The whole thing is static. But the way that static thing is shaped, or the events that occur within it, are determined as an expression of God.
That's I think, my understanding. Let's just see if we're on the same page here. That the natura naturans is the creative principle. It's what follows directly from God.
Right.
And natura naturata is the sequence of cause and effect subsequent to that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the point is that when you say necessarianism, it sounds like you're saying God couldn't be anything but what God is.
Spinoza definitely says that, almost in those words. That God acts by he says, by the same necessity whereby he exists.
Well, could I ask a question then, Patrick?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, things have changed since 1600 in terms of science, and you did make reference to modern physics, but I don't understand how this is based on modern science when we know so much more since Newtonian physics and the cause and effect universe. And now we know that a particle may become a wave, or a wave a particle, and that there is uncertainty. We don't have all the answers, and we know natural laws exist, of course. But I mean, does the science?
Could I just say, Ella, that everybody agrees that quantum mechanics is an incomplete theory.
Right. Yes.
And there are
I don't know who everybody is.
everybody
but-
who knows
well, I mean,
anything about it.
You'd have to give me a list. I don't know who
Huh?
everybody is.
Well, I can give I can give you one that would be.
Can I finish though, please?
Okay.
But I've read a number of scientific articles and philosophers who do believe that, you know, we have entered a new era in science. And yes, it's incomplete. We don't know the answers of the universe. And by the way, I never said that. I would never say that. My theory is that the universe is so complex, there's no way we could come up with such a definitive system in 1600, because there's no way we can do it now. But I think we have a lot more questions now than we do answers. But we have to look at the question.
Again, Ella, what you are focusing on here is the question of causal determinism. And what I'm hoping to explain, perhaps next day, is how necessitarianism is different from causal determinism. And necessitarianism is what is required to understand Spinoza's philosophy. So I am actually quite knowledgeable about the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, and I'm quite willing to go down this rabbit hole if it was of any interest to anybody else. But I don't think it is. I think it would just take us off course.
Well, I don't intend to do that, but can you tell me, do you think, Patrick, that the quantum physics that you are aware of applies to this?
Well, there is an interpretation of quantum mechanics which is actually quite Spinoza's. It's fully deterministic. It's the many worlds interpretation.
Okay, many.
I'm sure you've heard of.
Yes.
And it actually.
But you know, that's one of many approaches.
That's right. It's one of many, but it's on an equal footing with the Copenhagen interpretation or the Bohmian interpretation, which is also deterministic.
Yeah, I'm familiar with David Bohm.
Yeah.
But
Well,
yeah, I would be interested if you could bring that in, and I know time is limited, but I think it would add more.
Okay, I would talk a bit about the many worlds interpretation, because that actually dovetails quite neatly with not only Spinoza's necessitarianism, but also another sort of flip side of this, which we'll come to next time, the principle of plenitude. You may have noticed running through Spinoza a theme where he says that everything within God's power is created by God. If you think of, Proposition 16, it says that God creates everything that falls within the scope of an infinite intellect. There are no possibilities that are left unrealized by Spinoza's God. This turns out to be a sort of flip side of necessitarianism. I'll explain that maybe next week.
Thank you.
And it so happens, I'm not a partisan of the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, but it actually has the flavor both of necessitarianism and the principle of plenitude. It's fully deterministic. There are no randomness whatsoever. And it says that every possible future is actually realized. Now, I'm not a partisan of any interpretation of quantum mechanics for the simple reason that quantum mechanics is an incomplete theory. It is going to be superseded by something else. So I'm not going to hitch my worldview to, what scientists in the 21st century happen to think. I don't see why I should, because they're continually updating their theories. But I'll explain it a bit next time.
I'd like to add to that three things real quick. Number one is that Einstein came way after Newton, and he believed in Spinoza's God, as he explicitly said. So that's number one. Number two is that Hawkins wrote a book called A Brief History of Time. And in that book, I have a quote of his where he says that it may be that we just haven't discovered the theory yet, and that the world isn't, or the universe is in fact deterministic. So we just said we just can't explain it yet. So a great modern mind, Hawkins, is still saying it's possible that it is deterministic, and we just haven't understood it yet. The last thing I wanted to say is that keep in mind that Spinoza explicitly is not trying to create a cosmological system. He's not trying to go into physics or anything. He's trying to figure out what makes sense in order to create everlasting joy. That's his goal. His goal is not to explain physics. So, and he explicitly says, I think in the Invitation of the Intellect, that he's not trying to explain all of physics. What he's trying to do is figure out just enough to understand what his goal is and to achieve his goal. So I'm not sure that Spinoza...
I would agree with Blake that the essence of Spinoza is his ethical doctrine. Yeah. He has built his ethical doctrine on top of a metaphysical doctrine, which is what we're probing into in book one. And he has all this medieval theology that we have to get through in order to understand the metaphysical doctrine. But it's not so, I think my experience is, and I think the experience of other Spinozas is that once you get through the ethics, you realize that you can basically leave the medieval theology behind. There's a Buddhist metaphor about using a raft to cross a river. If you make it across the river, you don't have to carry the raft with you once you get to the other side. What in my experience with Spinoza, it is necessary to understand Spinoza's determinism, not his determinism, his necessitarianism, that really it is the foundation of his ethical doctrine, the realization that everything follows from the necessity of the divine nature in the, expression that he is most fond of using, or simply to get on board with the idea that things could not possibly be other than they are, and essentially to stop suffering by fighting with reality. That's Spinoza in a nutshell.
Yeah.
Okay, and you don't need any medieval theology to get on board with that program.
So I know this is bringing it back down to a very basic level, but so we don't have any free will according to Spinoza?
According to Spinoza, God does not have free will. Okay, we're going to come to that in the corollary to proposition.
I know you keep promising.
Huh? No, it's just it's down the road. One of the main agendas for book one
God doesn't have free
is
will.
to deny that God has free will because everything is necessary. And then in book two, he's going to attack the idea that humans have free will. In fact, he's going to conclude book two with the claim that will and intellect are the same thing. Why that's important is because the only power that Spinoza grants to the human mind is the power of understanding. And his ethical doctrine is based on our ability to have a correct understanding of our situation.
Yeah.
So
Okay, I
I
get
have
that.
a follow-up question. Go ahead, Anne.
I was just going to say, I get that God doesn't have free will because God's not a person and people have free will, but God creates in, so this, I could guess that it was going to say people didn't have free will from the reading of 27, but if God creates infinite things go on and on and on, but I guess they can be predetermined. But so free will and free thinking and choice
Well, it's
is infinite in that sense, and then determinist in that sense, because even though I may think I have free will and I may make my choices, from God's first mover point of view. Anyway, never mind. I'm getting myself.
well, Spinoza, we're coming to this next week. I mean, we're coming really to the climax of book one, which will be next week. But Spinoza's claim is that God is determined to create, by the laws of his nature, to create everything that is possible, that he has actually no choice in the matter. So there's an interesting, and I'm sure you've heard of the principle of sufficient reason. Okay, the idea that there's an answer for every why question. This is really basic to Spinoza. Okay, everything is in principle intelligible. There is a sufficient explanation, a sufficient reason or an adequate explanation for everything. And that implies necessitarianism. Things could not be other than they actually are. So in the history of philosophy, there are three names that are mostly associated with this. They're Leibniz, Spinoza, and Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, because his PhD thesis was called On the Fourfold Root of the Sufficient Reason, Principle of Sufficient Reason. The interesting thing is what each of those three people did with the principle of sufficient reason. Leibniz claimed that he could prove from the principle of sufficient reason that this was the best of all possible worlds, that God somehow exercised his free will to create the greatest amount of goodness. Schopenhauer claimed that this was the worst of all possible worlds, okay, that if it was any worse, it couldn't even exist. But Spinoza lands right in the middle and he says, this is the only possible world. There is only one possible history of the universe, and it contains all possibilities. And God is determined to act the way he does by the laws of his nature. God exists necessarily and acts by the same necessity whereby he exists, according to Spinoza. He is a pure act. That term actually comes from Catholic theology. It's sort of, the idea is somehow implicit in medieval theology, but theologians at the time tried to hedge it, okay, by claiming God has free will and that man has free will. But Spinoza goes all the way with the principle of sufficient reason and denies free will both to God and to man. And his ethical doctrine really has nothing to do with freedom of the will. It has to do with the power of understanding.
I wanted to make a quick comment about 28. Just looking at it and well, I guess this is taking us back to an earlier discussion, so I don't want to derail things too much, but
No, go ahead, Alex. Go ahead.
Okay, well, just quickly. So in 28, he's giving us this picture of basically causal chains, as I'm reading it, where things, finite things, which would be finite modes that are determined, and they kind of line up, it seems, causally determining one another, and that could go ad infinitum. And I think there was a point mentioned, a contrast there with Aristotle earlier on that bit about the infinite causal chain. I'm very interested in, so it seems like here we get a picture of what he earlier called, I believe, transitive cause, where here is a finite mode, and within its limited context, it's a transitive cause of another finite mode, seems to me. Yeah. But overall, all of this is happening within the context of God as the immanent cause of this entire process, right?
Right.
Of this entire network of causal chains extending ad infinitum. And I'm really interested in, like, how to, I mean, one finite thing causing another, it's fairly straightforward, kind of billiard ball causation is what I'm imagining. But then it seems like Spinoza wants us to really see God in the entire process. Like, it's as if the very power of one thing causing another is a manifestation of God, and that is there wherever you turn, in wherever anything happens, that's immanently God manifesting himself. And so what's interesting to me is, like, it's almost like there are these two levels. Like, we have the level of the finite things, but then it's all permeated by the immanence of God. And
Yeah, I think that
Could
a
I
way,
answer that, because I think that it really is key to Spinoza's view. He claims that we can have what he called the third kind of knowledge, intuitive knowledge of particular things, which enables us to see particular states of affairs as following from the necessity of the divine nature, even though we are not in a position to see the full chain of cause and effect that produces the particular thing. And he claims that this is accessible to us through what he calls knowledge of the third kind. That the mind can actually be trained to see everything that occurs as necessary, as not having the possibility of being other than it actually is. And that includes our own actions, our own inner lives, our circumstances, the whole shebang. Everything can be traced to his idea of God. That's what he means by having an adequate idea of anything.
Right.
yeah, if I may,
Cornerstone of Spinoza's ideas.
sorry, we missed that, Blake. We missed that.
Understanding that through the third kind of knowledge is one of the cornerstones of Spinoza's idea.
Yeah, the funny thing is, though, is that when you're talking about finite modes, you don't need the third kind of knowledge, really, because the principle of sufficient reason applies there too. Every single moment in the chain, we know that there has to be a complete explanation for it, right? And that complete explanation shows that it was determined. And so I think that that's a very, I think that a lot of people, they don't have.
You're correct, Robert, but you understand that the principle of sufficient reason is rejected by most contemporary philosophers, except for philosophers of religion, for the reason that it leads directly to necessitarianism, which is regarded as a sort of reductio ad absurdum, because outside of Spinoza, there is no major philosopher who advocates for necessitarianism. Most
I'm really,
really, that is true. And that's why I am recommending this book by Amy Karofsky. She says in her preface that she is the first philosopher in 300 years to make a case for necessitarianism, and I believe that's a correct statement. And most philosophers, if you were to ask them, would reject necessitarianism out of hand. And the reason why some people get bitten by the bug of Spinoza is that they realize that Spinoza is right about this and everybody else is wrong.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
quick follow-up just on the kinds of knowledge? So I'm curious then, in 28, when we're looking at one finite thing causing another, and we just stay with that level, that seems to be an example of the second kind of knowledge, kind of conceptual understanding of cause and effect, maybe mixed with the first.
We'll come to that in the second book. You see that the scope of what Spinoza calls reason is extremely limited. Okay, it's what can be known through what he calls common notions, which is properties that bodies have in common with each other, together with Spinoza's idea of substance and mode. And he states explicitly, somewhere towards the end of book 2, that it's not possible to arrive at an adequate idea of particular things through reason. You can sort of have general concepts, but the third type of knowledge this becomes clear in book 5. Its object is particular things. And Spinoza says that we can have an adequate idea of particular things through the third kind of knowledge. But it's clear from, I can't remember what proposition it is towards the end of book 2, he does say that it's not accessible to knowledge of the second kind, which is reason, which tells us about chains of cause and effect. But you see, once he allows for infinite chains of cause and effect, it's clear that if that is the criterion of adequacy, that we cannot attain to that, okay, because our minds are finite.
Okay, I just want to point out quickly that Spinoza does allow us an adequate knowledge of the essence of limited modes, right? Limited things. He does allow us.
That comes directly from a knowledge of God, according to Spinoza.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just simply saying that, you know, the third kind of knowledge is something that, okay, I don't want to turn this to turn into an argument, but it's something that I think you're giving too much emphasis to. It's just simply because we cannot apprehend the infinite chain of cause and effect sequences. That's the only reason that we need the third kind of knowledge, and in a sense it's intuitive, and I believe that intuition is grounded in our sense, especially when you're talking about the modern world and physics, that nothing accidental ever transpires in the realm of physics. There's always an efficient cause and an effect, right? And that's just something that we can just take for granted.
Well, there is this question that needs to be resolved in the mind of anyone who wants to go down the Spinoza's rabbit hole, is whether indeterminism in physics is an obstacle to Spinoza's necessitarianism. I don't believe that it is, but this is a subtle and deep question that we may not be able to cover in this group. In Amy Karofsky's book, she does actually address this particular question.
Yeah. And the other thing too is that, you know, necessitarianism is a notion that simply does not apply, or doesn't apply exclusively to cause and effect on the level of efficient causation. It's something that, for example, it is of necessity that certain properties follow from the essential nature of God, right? And when they follow of necessity, I think that, necessitarianism is something that is much broader than what some people are going to be preoccupied with if they
Could I-
constantly think of in terms of, just a moment, please. If they're constantly thinking of it in terms of like, oh, there's the uncertainty principle in modern physics, it's not really applicable. In the same way that a triangle at the time of Euclid and the time of Spinoza and the time of today, certain properties follow from the essence of a triangle of necessity. It's not possible that anything other than those properties follow from the form of a triangle. And so that's the kind of necessitarianism I think that Spinoza really is, what's most important in his work.
I think Blake, you should speak to this because I know you have religious doubts about determinism.
Yeah. There's three things potentially in the way most people think about it. There's three things that could possibly determine this change of state from one thing to another. So when a mode goes from one state to another state, there's three possible things that could cause that. One is the cause and effect, the deterministic cause and effect that we're all talking about. Two is free will, right? I'm not saying free will exists. I'm just saying in the mind of most people, they would think that free will is another factor. And the last thing they would think of is random events. That's the new physics we're talking about, right? The point about it is that we can show that free will doesn't exist beyond a doubt. And let's say random events do exist for a second. So then what you're saying is that there's two things that cause modes to go from one state to another. Natural cause and effect, deterministic cause and effect, and then random events. But you still don't get to free will. You see? So that's my point. So if you're saying, why did that person slap me? Well, if there's no free will and there's deterministic cause and effect, even if you add or take away random events, you still come to the same conclusion, which is nothing I can do about it. Nothing he could have done about it. It was just going to happen. You see? So the point I'm making here is that whether random things exist or not is immaterial. I don't think they exist, and neither did Einstein, and Hawking's questioned it. But even if you want to grant it and say, oh, it's been proven that random events exist, it still doesn't give you any kind of free will. It still doesn't give you anything that would negate what Spinoza's trying to say or lead to.
Well, one could say that I know Whitehead said it leads to the chance of novelty, of things, of opening up your thinking, your reasoning, and of new events occurring within the universe. And, certainly, as was mentioned before, no one knows. We have more questions than answers now. So I don't think I have that degree of certitude that you are discussing here, Blake, about the universe, because I think it's extremely complex.
Well, the thing I have certitude about is no free will.
Well, I mean, that is a discussion that I think
that's next week's discussion.
Oh, good. Because it has a lot of different aspects, and a lot of people might disagree with that.
Oh, I'm sure they do. And the reason Spinoza says is that we think we're free because we know what we want to get to, and but we don't know all the causes that cause that.
Yeah, I understand that. I
understand.
I read a lot about it. I understand it, but there's a lot of things we don't want to go into now, but that come into play from physics to chance that will need to be discussed, and we can't just dismiss it and say free will doesn't exist. It may not, but it's a conversation.
Yeah, and it's a conversation that should be based, I'm sorry if I sound like I'm repeating myself. It's a conversation that should be based on whether or not Spinoza has provided us with valid arguments that prove that free will is an illusion that we all suffer under. That's really where the essence of the philosophy lies. It's just not a question of like, do I believe in free will or do I believe in chance or anything like that? We're looking at Spinoza. Spinoza, in his view, he believes that he has demonstrated that the possibility that free will is just sort of hopelessly ludicrous idea if you look at his entire system. I mean, even God does not have any choices about what he does. And we are entirely subject to the power of God. And so there's no question that we don't have free will. And really what he's more interested in, Spinoza, at least in the first 2/3 of the book, is why is it that we believe we have free will? And and how much suffering follows from that. And then you get into the ethical part of the argument. But the other thing too is that I don't believe that when the 17th century physicists came up with a theory, and that involved things like force, right? Force going from one object to another. Right? So that's efficient causation, and things like some of the other general laws that the general law of inertia, for example. None of these things have really become obsolete. It's not like you look at the 17th century philosophers and say, oh, they're just so deluded when it came to physical sciences. They had no idea of what they were talking about. They're pretty sophisticated theories, that I think that many people consider them to be perfectly valid even today. And because that's really something that Spinoza relies on a lot in the early part of the second book, is a theory of a theory of physics. He uses a sort of common knowledge amongst the physical sciences, the physical philosophers of the day, about what physical nature is all about. And in that realm of physical nature, nothing happens by chance. Nothing happens by chance. If anything happened by chance, it would be a miracle. It would be, in other words, it's impossible. Everything happens of necessity in the realm of physics for the 17th century philosophers. And that's something that, again, Spinoza bases a lot of his arguments on that premise. So, Nick, do you have something to say? You have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Just for better planning for next session, so I will put a plug for the issue I'm interested in, Patrick.
Yes.
So this is this reference to the principle of sufficient reason and how that leads to Spinoza's conclusion of a strong necessitarianism. That would be very interesting for me. As you mentioned, some other guys might not go that far. So not for the debate here, but just in your presentation next week, if that link could be highlighted somehow, that would be really helpful for me. And after listening to this very interesting debate, I just have a thought in my mind that maybe for both sides, for the audience, I guess it will be most productive if we share insights rather than just to share opinion. In the sense that I personally don't buy in the conclusion of Spinoza, but I'm so motivated to read Spinoza because I want to understand how he formulates his ideas. And I think, it's a common sign for philosophers to hold the opposite ideas at the same time. There's nothing wrong with that, but it will be useful that we can get a bit more granular insights into the way that each and every philosopher formulates their theory rather than trying to validate or disapprove the conclusion of the guy is saying because the guy is dead for 300 years or whatever.
On the subject, Nick, of the principle of sufficient reason, for Spinoza, the way I see it is that the principle of sufficient reason plays a critical role in establishing the proof of the existence of Spinoza's God. But once he has established the existence of God as he defines it, his necessitarianism then follows from that by theological arguments, which are actually quite difficult to follow. On the other hand, if you trace a direct path from the principle of sufficient reason to necessitarianism, that's actually quite easy to follow. So perhaps what I'll do next day is first just state broadly Spinoza's conclusions about necessitarianism, and the converse of that, the principle of plenitude. That's proposition 16, the idea that everything that is possible is created by God. Both of those can actually, I think, easily be seen to be direct consequences of the principle of sufficient reason in the form that Spinoza uses them. However, that's not Spinoza's approach. Okay, what Spinoza wants to do is use the principle of sufficient reason to establish the existence of God and then do everything else by theological arguments, which makes it difficult to understand what he's on about. So it's useful to have both perspectives, but I would also urge anyone who is really interested in understanding the remaining part of book one to listen to that video by Amy Kurofsky, where she actually argues for necessitarianism without appealing to the principle of sufficient reason. The principle of sufficient reason is deeply out of fashion. But let me just give you a flavor of her argument, the one that really tickles me the most. It's an argument from Occam's razor. Occam's razor is the idea that all things else being equal, you should choose the simplest explanation. So suppose you're in a debate with the typical philosopher who wants to deny necessitarianism. It's the default position. Almost anyone you encounter on the street and you ask them, is it the case that things could be other than they are? Is it a real possibility that I could be wearing a red shirt instead of a navy blue shirt? They will say, yes, I could have chosen to do that this morning. And a necessitarian will say, no, it's not possible. They will say that for any given arrangement of things, okay, they could have different properties than they actually have. My shirt could have a different color.
How does that differ from determinism?
Just let me give the argument. You'll see that I'm not going to use determinism or even the principle of sufficient reason. This is just my favorite argument from Amy Kurofsky. Okay, so the person I'm disputing with says that things could be different, things could be other than they are. Okay, you have a state of affairs where things actually are as they are, and somebody comes along and says, no, they could be other than they are. So what they are saying is that In addition to the properties that these things actually have, they also have occult properties, in virtue of which things could be different.
They have opposite properties?
Occult, hidden properties.
Oh, occult. Okay.
Okay, that is the implicit claim of anybody who rejects necessitarianism. But there is no evidence whatsoever for these occult properties. The only evidence we have is the properties of things as they manifest themselves actually.
Well, it sounds like
So if you accept Occam's razor, you reject the occult properties. So that's her argument from Occam's razor. Okay, things could not be other than they are. She has many, many other arguments which are addressed to analytic philosophers, of which I am not one. I'm not particularly interested, but I just mentioned that particular argument because it doesn't appeal to determinism. It even works in the case where there is real randomness in nature, but that takes investigation.
You know what I think is an interesting
Doesn't
question?
even appeal to the principle of sufficient reason, which is
follow-up.
it sounds
the
like
most direct route.
Kantian noumena, basically. You can't know the thing in itself, is what she's alluding to.
Patrick, could I just a quick follow-up if you could explain how does an occult property become necessary by by contingency? What's the
It's
link
just
there?
saying that if it is possible that my shirt could be red at present, then my shirt must have some property, some unmanifest property, in virtue of which its color could change. But there is no evidence for the existence of such a property. That's all she's saying.
So something
If
like
there's no
could
evidence
it have been
for its existence, then there's no reason why you should subscribe to the idea that such a property belongs to my shirt. That's all.
would that be something like a
I'm
property?
just mentioning this as just one of the arguments that she advances, which is light years distant from the theological arguments we're going to have to dive into next week. That's all. It's just an example. I would also recommend to anybody, again, who wants to do a deep dive into the concepts in the last part of the ethics, to try and make an effort to understand why necessitarianism and the principle of plenitude are actually logically equivalent. This was pointed out, at least I never saw it pointed out by anybody other than Don Garrett, one of the well-known commentators, but it's implicit, not explicit, in Spinoza. We'll see it, that these two statements are actually logically equivalent. Okay, one statement is that the principle of plenitude, okay, it says that everything that is possibly the case is actually the case.
Spinoza says that.
It's implicit in Proposition 16. Just read the statement of Proposition 16, or the proposition towards the end that says that everything that is within God's power is created by God. So on the one hand, we have the principle of plenitude. Everything that is possibly the case is actually the case. On the other hand, we have necessitarianism. Everything that is actually the case is necessarily the case. And the interesting thing to think about is that those two propositions are actually logically equivalent. each of them implies the other. And that's something that you're not going to be able to see unless you think about it very hard. You will probably have to write out the proof. But if you think about it, you will realize that those two are the same. And I'll point out next day where Spinoza doesn't state this explicitly, he states it implicitly. And I first came across that observation in a commentary by Don Garrett in one of his essays on Spinoza. It's a really good exercise to see if you can understand Spinoza's way of thinking, even though Spinoza does not claim this as a proposition. It's not that difficult, but it requires thinking. So that's in the spirit of mathematical textbooks since the time of Euclid. We leave this as an exercise for the reader.
Could you just rephrase the
Okay.
proposition?
Okay, the principle of plenitude. Everything that is possibly the case is actually the case. Necessitarianism. Everything that is actually the case is necessarily the case. And the claim is that those two statements are logically equivalent, meaning that if one is true, the other is true. As I say, I'm leaving this as an exercise for people, anyone who's interested to think about it.
Patrick, could you use
Yes.
set theory to sort of parse that out?
Well,
You know?
okay, the way to parse it, okay, is what does it mean to say that something is impossible, not possible? Okay?
Well, I mean,
What it means is that, okay, sorry, I'm a
I'm
bit
thinking-
addled at this stage, but I'll come back to it. I'll come back to it next time.
I was thinking if you have a set of A, B, C, D, and E,
Yeah.
that's line one. And then line two, you have A and B. They
Mhm.
must be a part of A, B, C, D, and E, the first set,
Yeah,
correct?
correct.
So is that the proof?
No.
Okay.
No, you really have to just write those two propositions down and see if you can derive the implication in both directions.
Well, I mean, I didn't draw conclusions from it, but I don't think that the set is.
Okay, if you give me a minute, okay, I'll show you where I've written out proof. I just have to look for it. So if we could, Blake, if you can take down your screen share, and I'll see if I can find where I've written down the proof. If you just give me a minute, perhaps somebody else would like to.
Yeah, just while you're looking for that, I just want to share a quick thought. These two propositions involve three concepts: actuality, necessity, possibility.
Yeah.
So those three concepts are fundamental for the model logics. And what you are proposing is that there's some equivalence of the way we're formulating.
What I'm saying, in fact, is I'm saying is in fact known as modal collapse. Okay, that the
right. So there has to be some particular conditionality under which those three concepts come to meet each other in some way.
Yeah,
and that
if in fact there is only one possible world, which is Spinoza's view. Okay, that there are, you know how modal logic depends on the existence of many possible worlds. But if there is only one possible world, then everything is necessary.
Okay. What you said, I would agree in the sense of Leibnizian formulation. But since then, I think in the 50s, the 60s of last century, there are guys like coming out of the analytical tradition, reformulate the stuff. So I'm not updated on that. But anyway, So now I understand what you are saying is under some strict conditionality. So it's less striking as 10 minutes ago when I heard it. Okay,
Yeah, well,
so that,
it is necessary to think about it. I mean, I think that's obvious. Let me see if I can find this. Okay, okay, I will now share my screen if I can see how to do that. Oh, I'm on the wrong window. This is, sorry. I don't think I can. Just give me a minute. So please have another conversation while I sort this out. Because
or maybe another way of
Nick,
progress on this
please
is
address it to somebody else when I try to find this this document.
Okay, well, maybe I can just make some suggestions for the reading, because let's first of all, Patrick is going to make a complete presentation of necessitarianism next meeting, but that won't take as much time because we've discussed it so much now tonight.
Actually, all that remains, I mean, my intention is to do all of the remaining propositions up to 36. So all that remains in book one is the appendix. And I'd like to suggest that that somebody who hasn't presented anything so far might like to tackle this, because the appendix is a very easy read. It's a polemic against the traditional Abrahamic view of God, as contrasted with Spinoza's view. And it seems to me to have been written specifically for people who got lost trying to understand Spinoza's proofs. He basically said, as far as I can see, at some point, okay, I'm not going to spell it all out for you in plain language, in plain Latin. And because he knew that this was not ever going to be published within his lifetime, he could actually state things unreservedly and very provocatively. So it would be, I think, if anyone who hasn't presented is interested, it's a very easy thing to.
I nominate Anne.
Just pick out some highlights, okay, and explain how you react to them, and we can discuss them. It'll be very entertaining because it's very well written. And I think, Blake, you mentioned that this was your entry into Spinoza. So I'm sure you would second my suggestion that it's a really easy read compared with what we've been doing. But I would suggest, Robert, that we can defer that to the week after next. That there will be enough. If I am actually to go through the theological arguments in the way that at least Nick would like me to do, it will take a full 2-hour meeting just to cover the remaining propositions in book one.
Okay. One thing that I think that we haven't really done justice to is the propositions 22 and 23, which seem pretty important to me. So if you complete your presentation, then I'll talk a little bit about 22 and 23, because the relations between the modes and the attributes, and how finite modes follow from infinite attributes is a very good question, and it's something I think ought to be addressed.
Well, Spinoza really doesn't explain it.
I can make a presentation because he provides evidence elsewhere. It's not just implicit; it's quite clear what he would have argued himself. So, but he doesn't. You're right. He doesn't. Even in the letters, it just he makes cursory remarks, and it doesn't make a complete statement, but it's easy to provide an explanation.
Okay. Excuse me, Robert. I must see if I can find this document I'm looking for.
Oh, that's okay. So, what do you think, Anne? Do you want to take on the appendix for next week?
Oh, no, please. I am totally beginner at this.
Oh no,
I
I thought
suspected you weren't
don't-
good. I suspected you weren't going to go along with that.
look, we actually don't have to decide now if next week is going to be devoted just to the remaining propositions. So anyone who's interested or potentially interested could just have a look at the appendix in the course of next week and see if they're up for it.
Yeah. And also, I do think that Scholia 1 and 2 in Proposition 23 or Proposition 33 is actually worth looking at as well. In a way, they're even more interesting than the appendix. The Scholia for Proposition 23. But again, we'll just leave it till next week and see what happens.
Okay, I'll share my screen in response to Nick's question.
Are you giving that example, Patrick?
I told Nick that it was possible. Is this showing up?
Oh, I think that's my
Yes.
question. But I don't know. You were going to show a proof.
No,
I
I just said that. So I told Nick that.
Oh, this is a different. Okay.
Yeah, that I would explain something to it. So I have written it up here. Is it visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. So there are two principal ideas that are going to be covered in the remaining propositions of book one. One is plenitude and one is necessitarianism. Plenitude is, well, the basic statement is proposition 16. The way I've glossed it is that if something is possibly the case, it is actually the case. Okay, there are a few restatements of this in the remaining parts of the ethics. Proposition 35, whatever we conceive to be in God's power necessarily exists. The laws of God's nature have been so ample that they have sufficed for producing all things which can be conceived by an infinite intellect. God creates everything. Plenitude. The title comes, the Principle of Plenitude, it comes from a book by a historian of ideas called Lovejoy. I don't know if anyone has ever encountered it. The book is called The Great Chain of Being. That's where this term comes from. He traces this idea from Plato to Schelling. And Spinoza, of all the philosophers, is the one who articulates the most extreme version of it. For Spinoza, it's literally true that God creates everything that is within its power to create. Okay, the other one, necessitarianism, in nature, there is nothing that is contingent. Things could not be possibly different from what they are. God does not have free will.
Right.
The most striking statement, things could have been produced by God in no other way and in no other order than they have been produced. There is, for Spinoza, only one possible world, only one possible history of the world.
Yeah, I think
I've glossed that. Just let me finish. If something is actually the case, it is necessarily the case. So those are the two propositions. And here, Nick, here are the proofs that necessitarianism implies plenitude and plenitude implies necessitarianism. It's 2 lines. Anyone can figure it out with a bit of patience. I think I'll leave it at that. But here for you, Robert, especially, this is from Schelling, okay, where Schelling actually states the equivalence of plenitude and necessitarianism. The proposition is absolutely undeniable that there's a misspelling, that from the divine nature, everything follows with absolute necessity. That everything which is possible by means of it must also be actual. This is from the System of Transcendental Idealism. I found that quote in Lovejoy's book. So presumably Schelling got this from Spinoza.
Oh, he had good reasons for making the statement. He just didn't get it from Spinoza. But yeah, it's true.
I don't know.
Schelling was a very good, very close student of Spinoza. Yeah, and, you know, the
thanks,
interesting
Patrick.
thing is in the history of ideas, you know, it's true. You can go all the way back to Plato, and there's all kinds of different reasons. What I'm interested in knowing is where and how does Spinoza prove that plenitude is a reality? The principle of plenitude is a reality. How does he prove that?
Well,
you know,
in these propositions. Go back to proposition. Everything following now is going to be an unfolding of Proposition 16. Okay? And Proposition 16 is really just a direct consequence of Proposition 11. So you can trace it back.
Yeah. I mean, I am aware of the arguments that he's making. I'm just saying that's more interesting than knowing whether or not the idea of the principle of plenitude is something that is scattered throughout the history of Western philosophy, you know?
Well, it's actually interesting to trace the thread and to see that Spinoza articulates the strongest version of the principle of plenitude. Spinoza is really radical. You know, most commentators, sympathetic commentators of Spinoza, attempt to domesticate him in one way or another. But Spinoza takes no prisoners. He really is out on a limb in so many respects. And this is just one of them.
Can I ask a quick question about
okay, so I'll close this if I can figure out how to do it.
Just the principle of plenitude. I mean,
yeah.
Just kind of at a first glance. So it seems to me like there could be, there are contradictory possibilities, right? Like the possibility that now I'm wearing a red shirt and that now I'm wearing a green shirt. And it seems like, I mean, prima facie, those are possible anyway. And it would seem like they would both have to be true. They would both have to be actual if this principle holds. I'm curious.
Well, the principle, okay, as it would apply to that situation, the principle of plenitude would say that since I am not wearing a red shirt, it must be impossible for me to be wearing a red shirt. If it were possible for me to be wearing a red shirt, that would actually be the case.
I see.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Alex, sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm just confirming, I guess. Is there a certain maybe actualism then going on? I guess going beyond that, I mean,
I'm not quite sure what that
Curley.
term means in contemporary philosophy, actualism. Perhaps you're familiar with it?
I mean, not in any technical way, but it is interesting that so Spinoza, in a sense, would begin with what is the case, and in fact, for him, that is necessarily the case, and then infer to possibility based on that, rather than the other way around.
Well, if you look at Proposition 16, you see he actually mixes the two together already in the statement of the proposition, because he has everything necessarily, everything that falls under the infinite intellect exists necessarily. He actually has amalgamated both necessitarianism and plenitude in the statement of Proposition 16. But in proving Proposition 29, he appeals to Proposition 16. And Proposition 16 is really just a restatement of one of his proofs of the existence of his God as he defines it. So for Spinoza, everything is funneled through the theological argument, but you can arrive at the principle of plenitude or the principle of necessitarianism without any theology. You can even arrive at it without the principle of sufficient reason, which is what Amy Brodsky does.
James, can I ask you something, James?
Yeah.
Are you interested in taking on the appendix?
No, thanks.
Okay.
Well, could
But I have a,
I reiterate the suggestion that we have a week to think about who will do the appendix?
Oh, okay.
but I have a question though. This idea of plenitude and necessitarianism is that means that we have no really as individuals, we have no agency and maybe no responsibility that for ourselves in terms of decision making and so forth. And in that sense, does that mean that we have no responsibility, that everything that we do, you say, well, just God did it, right?
Blake, would you like to answer? I'm sure you must already have dealt with this in your writing.
Who, me, Blake?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote about it in that paper that I put up on the chat. Basically, if you have a car works, most of us would agree it works deterministically, right? And the car does something you don't want it to do, then you have to apply some kind of effort into the car, like to fill up with gas or fill up the tire with air or whatever in order to correct any problem that it's got, right? So even though it's a deterministic thing, you have to take forces to make it operate the way you want to operate. Now, likewise, when a person, if they're deterministic like a car, they commit a crime, you need to apply some kind of pressure to that person so that you change his state so that he's not going to do it again. And that involves prison because he doesn't like prison. You see what I'm saying? So in other words, even though he was deterministically determined to perform that act, it still makes a lot of sense to apply punishment as if he was guilty, because you want to change his internal state so he doesn't perform those actions anymore. Just like you would fix your car, you would take an effort to do something to make it so your car stays running so you can go on your trip. Does that make sense?
So you're not necessarily making a moral judgment about the guy, and punishment is not actually punishment essentially or per se. It's more like a modification of the person.
Yeah, and the reason I use the word punishment is because you're making him experience something he doesn't want to experience. So it's kind of perceived as punishment,
Yeah.
But yeah, it's dispassionate. I mean, it's just like fixing your car, And that's the whole idea behind Spinoza anyway, because if you understand determinism from the third kind of knowledge, you realize things are the way they are. There's nothing you can do about it. So why get upset about it?
Sure. But that means that you could also hire a good lawyer to, after you commit the crime and say, well, ultimately it's not this person's fault. It's it's how he was created by God. God did it.
Right. Well, that's the interesting thing. Remember the Jimenez brothers who killed their parents, and then they said, well, they were mistreated and all. Here's the point about that. Every single criminal act can be traced to some prior cause. Every one. So if someone says, well, I did it because my parents treated me this way or whatever, well, I mean, that's not surprising. It's always there's always a prior cause. So therefore, there's always a reason. If you allow someone to say, well, I did it, I mean, now if they have a gun to their head and they do it, then you can understand it because that's an immediate thing. But if they don't have a gun to their head, they're doing it because of their internal state is making them decide to do a criminal act, right? So you have to apply a force to them to make that internal state change, right? So if someone puts a gun to my head, it's not my internal state, it's my just desire to survive at that very moment. You see, so you don't have to punish me for it because as soon as you remove that state, I'm not going to do it. So all you got to do is remove the gun from my head. But if someone decides I'm going to rob that house, well, it's obviously a product of all the prior causes. There's never a doubt, So when they go to court and they say, "Well, this happened to me and that happened," that's always true. There's never been a criminal act that wasn't caused by some prior causes,
For
So
precisely that reason, when you find the principle of sufficient reason basically comes down to a complete explanation for why somebody did something, right? So you provide the complete explanation, and then you realize that all those points that contribute to a complete explanation were also effects that followed necessity from other causes.
Right.
It's not a stretch to easily imagine how everyone does what they do of necessity. There's never a moment where there's any kind of free choice or contingency in their life at all.
Right.
Everything just follows of necessity because the principle of sufficient reason shows that there was no way a person could not have failed to do these things. That's what a sufficient explanation provides, right? A sufficient explanation shows that a person really could not have failed to do whatever they did that was wrong. And so for that reason, Spinoza says, well, you see, that's why, if you're a vicious criminal, you shouldn't feel so bad about it. You know what I mean? Because it's just followed of necessity. And the other thing is that that's why ideas of good and evil and all these other things are just tossed out by Spinoza. They're not grounded in reality.
Right. So good and evil is just a perspective. That's all.
Yeah.
So
That's a quick question about sorry, look.
Well, I was going to say this is something I think that's very interesting to me because when a religious person and a non-religious person are debating, the religious person is going to say, without their anthropomorphic God, that you have no real grounding in good and bad. So, but I say that you do just based on humanity, because, for example, you and I, all of us here, breathe similar air, with oxygen and stuff. We all need the same kind of air. So we can all agree that a bunch of ammonia in the air is bad. And we can all agree. And so we're determining the reason good and bad is similar is because our physical bodies are constructed similarly. To the extent that they're similar, we all agree. But we might disagree about vanilla versus chocolate ice cream because there's different states in our bodies that make us different. So we disagree about what the better ice cream is, you see. But we all agree on air and temperature. We all want it around 70 degrees. So, and to the extent that we want different temperatures is our physiology is different. So good and bad are derived from our physical structure. And you can derive all those things, not to kill, not to do bad things, not to steal. All those things can be derived directly from our physical structure.
The funny thing is that all this stress on necessitarianism and the lack of freedom, and all I'm a little bit concerned that most people will be satisfied that this is the fundamental general theme in Spinoza, and therefore what more can be said? We don't have any choices, everything is determined, and that even things like good and evil are just dismissed as being subjective illusions that we subject ourselves to. But there's still, nevertheless, a whole lot of really very interesting things I can assure you. We're just getting started. So despite the fact that necessitarianism seems to suggest that it answers a lot of questions. There really is much, much more. The implications are difficult to anticipate, all the things that Spinoza engages with in our moral being, and especially
Well,
knowledge. I
I
mean,
think it's
clearly knowledge is the most
necessary to
important
realize
principle.
this really isn't going to come into play until about book 5.
Yeah, it doesn't
But
really.
book 5, Spinoza would have seen as the culmination of his work. In fact, for the first 3 books, it's the parallelism of the attributes that is really the important thing, because he's going to use it in book 2 to elaborate his theory of mind, his theory of knowledge, and in book 3, his theory of the emotions and the passions. And it's only after he's got through all of that that he starts on his ethical theory in book 4. And well, I think determinism is probably enough to get you through book 4, but I don't think it's possible to get any grip on book 5 without understanding necessitarianism. But that's, of course, way down the road.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
On the 5th part of the ethics, and I want to make sure first I'm in the right part of the book, of the power of the intellect or on human freedom.
That's
Is
right.
that what you're referring to?
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say, when you mentioned that, I turned to that part of the book, and he does start talking about ethics, and then he talks about perceptions and feelings, emotions of the soul. I mean, it's very different from what we're discussing now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Ella, you might remember that I suggested that a good way into Spinoza is to have a look at the abridged version of the ethics. It's called the Road to Inner Freedom. It just selects highlights from books 3, 4, and 5. No proofs. And it's a good motivation for confronting the difficult stuff. The difficult stuff is what we're doing now on book 2. Book 2, yeah. I regret to say, is harder than book 1. It's really hard. But then once we get past book 2, it's much plainer sailing.
Yeah, I can see some challenges, but it's not that I don't get it. I think, not that I am understanding every part of it, and this discussions help, but, it's a lot of questions that arise. And then, as Nick said earlier, there is an issue with there being a little bit of, well, this is the way it is. And, philosophically, we need to challenge that.
Sorry, what was that you just said? What is just the way it is?
Like Nick was saying earlier, I don't want to use the word like dogmatism or anything that harsh, but there's a bit of, well, this is what Spinoza says, and this is the way it is.
No, see, that's something that I want to militate against fundamentally. It's not philosophy if a person stands up and says, everything that transpires in the world happens of necessity. Yeah. That's not philosophy. And that's philosophy is addressing yourself to the arguments, deciding for yourself whether the arguments are valid.
Right.
That's what we're doing when we're doing Spinoza.
Yeah.
Okay. Again and again, I will repeat this. Spinoza takes nothing for granted at all. There's always a proof.
Okay. And what I'm saying is, if we are questioning as philosophers, can we not question proofs.
Sure, certainly, you can question the validity of the proof.
And that's all I'm trying to do. And
Well, why would you talk about dogmatism? There's nothing dogmatic.
No. I didn't want to use the word dogmatism. I'm just saying, you know, and maybe when you hear the tape, you'll see, it's like, this is the way it is. This is what Spinoza says, and this is the way it is. Has been stated in various ways. And I feel it's important to sort of go there and question it a little bit. It's not that he's not right. I don't even know if he's right or wrong.
Exactly. I'm completely with you on this point.
Yeah. Yeah.
At no point in time, again, does Spinoza say,
agree.
this is the way that Spinoza says it is, and so that's the way that it is. That never happens in this book.
No,
Never.
not in the book. What I'm talking about, I'm referring back to Nick's comment earlier, where he said, and Nick, you can come in here, that maybe we need to watch how we say things, that they're not, oh, this is the way it is. How we're talking in the group, not what Spinoza is saying. Not you particularly, Robert, but this is fact, this is the way it is. And then, of course, you're going to get somebody that comes back and says, well, wait a minute. And that's the way it should go, you know, questioning things that are stated as facts. Because the facts are complex. We don't know the facts.
I agree, Ella, that I would love to have them debunk the many worlds theory as they promised you. I'm waiting with bated breath for that one. That was one of the times when they said to you, "That's fact. It's been debunked."
Yeah, they have said a number of things are fact.
No, I'm sorry. This isn't a fair representation of what I said. But Ella, to speak to your point, the situation here is that Spinoza is almost unreadable to somebody who comes on it for the first time. And even though we're doing a close reading of the ethics, we have rarely been able to delve very deeply into Spinoza's arguments and pick them apart. It's simply too difficult. So what has happened is, because there are a few of us who have been over this ground many times, and it actually does take many readings simply to understand what he's getting at. Okay, what ends up, I think, inevitably happening is that we just give a digested version of our understanding. I can't really see how we could make progress through the entire book without making that sort of compromise. There are 250 or 300 propositions in the ethics.
And that's a good point. You make a good point.
We're covering them at the rate of about 5 a week, which means that it will take a year at this rate to get through. So the sort of, what we're sort of hoping to achieve is to actually keep a group together for that period of time. And it's really not given in advance that that's going to succeed. I have never actually heard of a collective reading of the ethics that has got beyond, perhaps halfway through book 2, but never to the end. And it really, I think, is a worthwhile goal to try to get through the entire book in the course of a year. And it's unfortunate, but inevitable in a situation where some of us have actually read this many times and others are completely new to it, that there is going to be the type of disparity that is off-putting for
No,
neo-Nazis.
I-
I
and
don't think it can be
I
avoided.
agree with you, and there is a disparity. However, people do come in with different ideas. They come in knowing different philosophies and with different points of view. So it is a difficult situation because there's a task to accomplish within a year. And importantly, we all want to learn Spinoza, or I do. You may know it, but I'd like to learn it. But at the same time, I want to be able to feel free to question it or to have my ideas considered and addressed to the extent that we do have some time to do it. And I don't feel we're rushing at all. And maybe you want to pick up the pace. I could understand that so that it could be finished. But I'm on board with sticking to the task. I'm all for the task and concentrate.
Okay, well, let's just look at the degree of detail that we have gone into the proofs. Blake, you just summarized in one or two sentences each of the proofs in the propositions that you presented today. Would it have been reasonable to go through it line by line? I don't think so.
I don't either. And that's not what I'm saying.
But it's also true that not all the propositions are as demanding as others, right? I mean, I think if you choose the right propositions and you do a sort of exhaustive reading of those and the ones that are straightforward, like the 28, for example, I don't think anyone has to dwell on that. It's pretty straightforward. Whereas, and the other thing too is that, Patrick, like for example, the physics that's introduced, in the second book, clearly we can just do an overview of that because that's so complex that, everyone would get stuck. You can easily get stuck in the physics. So just to do an overview of that, that's perfectly acceptable as well. I think that's what we should do. But at the same time, I do think it's very worthwhile to look very closely at some of the propositions and show how the argument actually tries to demonstrate the truth of something. And because that's the heart of the philosophy. Having said that, I don't know how many of you were here last week, but when I tried to do that with proposition 21, I made a complete mess of it. So you shouldn't use me as an example, okay? As somebody who can explain a proposition. But I think it's worthwhile to try to choose.
Are we agreed that in a case like that, a live reading is not helpful? The text is too difficult. Somebody has to actually act as an interpreter and summarize the argument.
Yeah.
And simply, if you like, always state as a caveat, this is my understanding of what Spinoza is saying. This is my assessment of his arguments. But I think we can't really take it, line by line and ask of every sentence whether we agree or disagree.
No. But again, I do believe that some time can be spent on any given really powerful proposition. One of the propositions that shows up all throughout the latter books, the ones that he really relies on. Sometimes that's even just a definition.
We'll see. Let's have this discussion again next week, because I do intend to go into the theological arguments, and they're really hairy. They're really difficult. But let's just see what the response is going to be if I do that. Okay,
that sounds good to me. And again, I think that I will do 22 and 23 if there's time. I'll do 22 and 23 because I think that they're really important to know those, because that's the whole. That's really the only place that he talks about the relation between the infinite attributes, infinite modes, and infinite mediated modes. That's the only place where, until later on in the book, that's the only place that he touches on that subject. So, okay, so we've gone well over time. This is quite extraordinary. It's almost 11 o'clock. So this was a very somber meeting.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. And I have to say, this is the first philosopher that I have ever come in contact with that is thoroughly intimidating. And when I started to read the first things along with you, I went, oh my God, I don't understand this.
Yeah. Did you read Descartes, Anne?
I have, yes.
Okay, well, that's good.
So,
because,
you know, some people, your mind just thinks like they think. I don't think like Spinoza at all.
Oh.
Do you know what I mean? Sometimes you read and it's like you get it, and you just really get it, and you understand it. And anyway,
it's true. Even in his prose sections, even in the Scholia and the appendix, sometimes he has a very peculiar form of argument that he makes in the prose sections as well. So there's sometimes they're a little bit tangled, but always quite sensible.
If I can repeat something I said before, is that what I found is that in any language, simple statements can be interpreted many different ways. You know, like you all understand that. And the problem with Spinoza, he has an idea in his head about, you know, his philosophy, and he's trying to write it down. And it was written in a different language. It was written a long time ago, and it's hard to grasp exactly what he's trying to say. But the beauty that I've found of the geometrical method is that you can interpret one of these propositions and say, okay, I understand it, and then go to the next, and go to the next, and go to the next. And then all of a sudden, something seems to contradict a previous proposition. So then you say, whoa, it seems like there's a contradiction here. Well, what happens is your mind has to reinterpret that prior proposition in a way that everything's consistent. Because when you do that, what you find is the whole of the ethics is one system that's completely consistent throughout. It's just every place where you say, well, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't make sense. That's just an interpretation thing. So he's not saying what you think he's saying. He's saying,
you know, in the case of Schelling, he contradicts himself so often. It's incredible, right? And he's a different kind of thinker altogether. But after, it takes a long time to get used to, because he'll come along and he'll make a statement, a categorical statement of one kind or another, and then 2 pages later he's saying exactly and precisely the opposite thing, you know, and you're just like, what is going on here? But after a while, you sort of realize that there's a sense in which everything that he's saying is true. But again, it's very unlike Spinoza, because Spinoza, they can be reconciled with one another, you know, whereas with Schelling, it's almost like he's saying it's the nature of the world. The principle of non-contradiction doesn't apply in Schelling's philosophy, you know, it just doesn't apply at all. It certainly does in Spinoza. He's very, very conservative rationalist. He's a conservative rationalist. That's the best way to understand Spinoza. He doesn't want to break any of the rules. And so in that sense, he's relatively easy, you know. You don't have to deal with the things that are problematic, because it's straightforward rationality. It's just pure logic, you know. If you're a rational human being, and I think we all are, you should be able to understand him. He's not asking for anything that's beyond rationality, you know. So I don't know about everybody else. I'm gonna call it a night. You can stay on.
Okay, before you go, Robert, because of all of the Zoom bombing at the beginning, okay, I turned off my recording and missed a couple of propositions that that Blake presented in my recording. So I think we'll have to use yours.
Sure. I don't mind.
I'll see if it's possible if you upload it to YouTube, I'll see if I can download it from YouTube and edit
I'm
it.
sure you can.
I don't know if I can. I'll see.
Yeah. I download things from YouTube all the time. Don't ask me why. I just
outside of YouTube. Do you understand?
I'm sorry?
I would need to. Okay, YouTube provides a facility to download a video onto a device within the application. I would need to download it outside of the application. Maybe.
Oh yes, I realize that. I realize that.
Yeah. Okay.
But again, it's easy to do. I mean, you just have to have some kind of software. I forget what it's called.
Okay.
And the other thing is that, oh yeah, I don't think that what we have posted so far, it's urgent that it be edited anytime soon, you know. So, and perhaps maybe what's up there, if the conversation becomes a little out of focus, it's not important to remove it anyway, because anyone who's watching the video will just skip over it.
No,
you know, they'll just fast
I'll just
forward
mark it. Generally, I would just mark it as off topic, unless it's positively offensive, and in that case, it would be necessary to excise a portion.
Yeah. And I don't think there's anything. Even the bombers are not really all that.
Well,
offensive.
I mean, that would have to go away before putting it on you. At least, I think it would have to go before putting it on YouTube and being associated with it.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to post this video to YouTube. If you can download it.
Post it privately. When you upload it to YouTube, you can mark it as private. Understand?
Okay.
And we'll keep it private until I have edited it. Got it?
Oh, okay. Because of the Zoom bombers, is that what you're concerned about?
Yeah, don't you remember the
Oh yeah, but I don't think anyone's really going to be offended by a bunch of Zoom bombers.
No, I don't think that.
Who knows? Maybe somebody would be offended. So yeah, you know, we should err on the side of caution. So, okay, so nobody's going to volunteer. I did my best. I tried to encourage somebody to take on the appendix, but it doesn't appear that anyone wants to do that. So, and it's not really important that we talk about the appendix because it's pretty easy to read. So everyone who wants to can read it.
It would be a shame not to do it, since it's really much easier going than the rest of book one.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of picking out some of his more provocative statements for discussion. That's all.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, he has a knockdown argument against free will somewhere early on in the appendix. It would be nice to pick that one out and see how people respond.
Yeah. Okay, so anyway, as you said, we could decide that, make arrangements for the appendix next week in the next meeting. So, so that's what I'll do. I'll put it up and I'll put it on private so you can do whatever you want with it. Okay, Patrick. All right, I'm going to go now. So I'm going to leave the Zoom on, but I just have to go. Okay, so have a good night, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert.
Like, I would urge you to look at this video that I mentioned.
Yeah, I've got it up. I'll look at it.
Yeah. I even have the PDF of the book that she's talking about, if it's of any interest to you.
Yeah, it is. Please send it to me.
Well, it'll be a zip file. But I'll see if I can just mail it to you.
Okay, yeah. Or you could put it up somewhere where I can download it, whatever's convenient.
Yeah, okay. Okay.
So this is an aside, but Patrick, are you from Ireland or England? Can I?
From Ireland originally, although I live in Montreal. I have been living here
Oh,
pretty much
okay.
all my adult life.
Yeah, because I have your last name in my family tree.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
So hello, cousin.
Where are you from, Ella?
Obviously America.
America's a big place.
Oh, well, but my ancestors have been here since pretty much the beginning. So a long time.
The
Yeah.
Pilgrim.
The Pilgrims. Yeah.
Really?
Yep. Very American.
Mhm.
But and actually McBride is actually another name in the family tree.
We're all one family.
You're not related to Martina, are you?
She spells her name with a Y, not an I.
Oh, well, but they changed the spellings.
Yeah, that's true too.
When they hit America,
Right.
things happen when you're living in the wilderness, So,
You know what's interesting is my wife and I did that genetic test, and we discovered that like 9 generations back we're cousins.
well, it happens. That's a lot of generations, though. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's funny. Yeah, I could see that. In America, for instance, if they came here, when did they come here, in 1700s or earlier? Your relatives, do you know?
No idea. I never really followed that.
Oh, okay.
My background is before me, it was really muddy. So it's no telling.
Yeah. Was it Scottish though? Did you do the
Yeah, that I don't know either. So yeah, is it Scottish or Irish? I don't know, because there's McBride and there's MacBride.
yeah, yeah.
Tell you something. So it's complicated. Who knows?
Yeah. Well, I hope you don't mind if I ask. We're not,
Not at all. I don't
no,
care.
so it's all British Isles stuff.
Patrick, do you know Castle Matrix?
What's the name? I didn't catch it.
Castle Matrix, Matrix, in Rothkiel, Limerick.
Oh, Rathkiel, the name rings a bell, not the other one. But I don't have any connections there. I have relatives in Clare, which is one county over, but not in Limerick. Sorry, who was asking there?
Scott.
Scott, yeah.
Do you have relatives or any other connection?
Yeah, my biological grandfather owned the castle. He bought it for $200 after World War II, and then he refurbished it, and then he just took off and went off into his Jungian Irish heraldry thing. Yeah, but now it's a big tourist attraction.
Yeah, I'm afraid it doesn't ring a bell. Perhaps if I look it up, something might fall in place.
That's a pretty cool story, Scott.
Yeah. Yeah, I went to it one time and it was very nice. And I had him write a letter to Jimmy Page, the lead guitarist for Led Zeppelin, to see if he could possibly let me in to see Aleister Crowley's house on Loch Ness. Page bought the house and then gave it to his childhood friend Malcolm Dent. But Dent was so sick of people coming to see the house that he just forbade anyone to come on the property.
Oh.
Yeah. So my grandfather wrote him a letter with the letterhead from Castle Matrix, and I thought this will surely get me in. So I got all dressed up, and I took a bus and a ferry and a train, and then another bus, and then I finally arrived. And then he said he would call the police if I didn't leave immediately. And then the buses weren't driving anymore, so I had to hitchhike back to town. So the spirit of Aleister Crowley didn't let me in to see the house.
Oh, darn. Oh, that's sad. Yeah, that must have been disappointing.
Yeah, I was on the lawn with my book reading the poetry out loud. It was a really romantic experience. I was 20, 21. Yeah. 20 or 21.
Wow. Well, make sure you write that down, in your family history.
Okay.
Cool story.
Excuse me, everybody. I think I'll say goodnight and see you next week.
Good night, Patrick.
Thank you very much, Blake and Patrick.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Night, everyone. Mhm.
And yeah.
Not everyone. Enjoy listening to.